Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Shadowed City Podcast. I am your host, Larry, and I just want to wish everybody for real a happy Father's Day to all the dads and fathers out there. Now I got some shows to go over, and starting with GPW/GCW. Elimination Chamber for the GPW Women's World Championship. Jeannie Jaw versus Britt Monet versus Ali Small versus Countess Cyclone versus Chanel Baltimore versus Whitney Winters, with Chanel Baltimore walking out the champion. Akane versus Brian Bay, with Akane walking out victorious. No Holds Barred, Tiny D versus Cash Gordy, with Cash Gordy walking out victorious. 15-minute finisher match. Onryo versus Jay La Basita, with Onryo walking out victorious. Happy Father's Day, Gino.
Who's your daddy?
Funny. Joshua Bacon versus Spicy Smiley, with Joshua Bacon walking out victorious. Madman Classic match between Air Vigor versus Alexander Galloway, with Alexander Galloway walking out victorious. GPW World Heavyweight Championship. The Dog Rob Anderson versus Alpha versus the Champion Blade, with Alpha walking out the new champion. The One Championship in the One Rules. Trey Nolan versus Champion Ranger Rogue, with Trey Nolan walking out the new champion. And Tony Rose versus Tyson Storm, with Tyson Storm walking out victorious. NCPW Beatdown, North Carolina Pro Wrestling Beatdown. NCPW Bloodlust Championship, Falls Count Anywhere. Jen versus Paige Sky Smith versus the champion Artemis, with Artemis retaining the gold. Dragonheart and his partner versus Kando Dragon and Kabuki Dragon, with Dragonheart and his partner walking out victorious. Almighty Ace versus Duke Maine, with Almighty Ace walking out victorious. Britt Graves versus Madison Landon, with Britt Graves walking out victorious. Underground, AJ Woods versus Aaron James, with AJ Woods walking out victorious. The Deranged Clown Insidious versus Big T versus Ghost Edwards versus Cold Steel versus the Phantom Eddie Walker, with the Phantom Eddie Walker walking out victorious. Primetime JoJo versus Jay Monster, with Primetime JoJo walking out victorious. 8-way matchup, which was won by Lewis West. Rob Anderson, the Dog, and Muerte El Guapo versus the Savage John Robb and Buster Anderson, with Muerte El Guapo and Rob Anderson walking out victorious. Now for WCCW. LJ Rocks versus Nikita Evans, with Nikita Evans walking out victorious. No Holds Barred, David Dyer Wolf Pope versus Carlos Guerrero, with David Dyer Wolf Pope walking out victorious. Falls Count Anywhere, Yuri Laney versus Sin Tavia C. Boulay, with Sin Tavia C. Boulay walking out victorious. Gar versus Lenny Payne, with Lenny Payne walking out victorious. SKG versus Hannah Hannibal, with Hannah Hannibal walking out victorious. XPWF Made It Famous match, Jay Vega versus Uakari, with Uakari walking out victorious. Big Fran versus Jeannie Jaw, with Big Fran walking out victorious. Extreme Rules Shadow versus Joe Fox, with Joe Fox walking out victorious, with special guest referee Monarch Calypso. And in the main event, Queen Scarlett Shields versus Gabrielle Salas, with Scarlett Shields walking out victorious. Now for the Millie Championship Tournament. Dex Michaels versus Ranger Rogue, with Ranger Rogue advancing to the second round. Sean Smith versus Big Lou, with Big Lou advancing to the second round. Flash versus the Dog Rob Anderson, with the Dog Rob Anderson advancing to the second round. Ivy Lowe versus MG, with MG advancing to the second round. Ranger Rogue versus Big Lou, with Ranger Rogue advancing to the finals. The Dog Rob Anderson versus MG, with MG headed to the finals. Ranger Rogue versus MG, with Ranger Rogue walking out victorious and winning the tournament. Texas Death Match between Travell Daniel and Nels Wade, with Nels Wade walking out victorious. All-Star Pro Season 4, Episode 7 now. Ultimo versus Nitro Cruz, with Nitro Cruz walking out victorious. El Jefa versus Bandita, with El Jefa walking out victorious. K9 Quan versus Don Wildside, with Don Wildside walking out victorious. No Holds Barred Kando Dragon versus Granddaddy Handsome, with Kando Dragon walking out victorious. Taryn Williams versus Kira, with Kira walking out victorious. Noah Dixon versus Blackjack, with Blackjack walking out victorious. Television Championship, the Savage John Robb versus Frank Ortiz, with Frank Ortiz retaining the gold. All-Star Pro Grindhouse Championship, Rockstar Cali versus the champion HBIC Nisha, with HBAC Nisha retaining the gold. And in the main event, Grindhouse Championship, Ace Thompson versus Jay Stone Jones versus Chris Legend, with Chris Legend walking out victorious. All-Star Pro Pal Driver Season 4, Episode 11, KD versus Mean Mike Shields, with KD walking out victorious. Nina Schmidt versus Miss D, with Miss D walking out victorious. Jackson Mitchell versus Shinjo, with Shinjo walking out victorious. J Rock versus J Monster, with J Rock walking out victorious. Jake King versus the Ghost J Jin, with the Ghost J Jin walking out victorious. Sean Smith and the Dog Rob Anderson versus Jesse Harper and Reese the Destroyer, with Reese the Destroyer and Jesse Harper walking out victorious. Juan Sanchez versus Alex Knight, with Alex Knight walking out victorious. Paige Sky Smith versus Sonia Ortiz versus Reagan Anderson, with Sonia Ortiz walking out victorious. And in the main event, Adam Matthews versus Lil Devil, with Lil Devil walking out victorious. Now for ASW. 420 Hardcore Championship Fatal 5-Way Hell in a Cell. OG Bishop Freeman versus Big Swole versus Psycho versus Grimlord versus the champion Kazuma Kong, with Grimlord walking out the new champion. 2 out of 3 No Weapons Madison Outlaw versus Angelina Angelo, with Angelina Angelo walking out victorious. Obsidian Vex and Ventura Onyx, the champions, defending their titles against a mystery team which turned out to be Haley Ramone and Eve Steele, with Haley Ramone and Eve Steele walking out the new champions. 2 out of 3 Light Tubes and Tax, Nagasaki versus Killian Bain, with Nagasaki walking out victorious. Triple Threat 2 out of 3 Jay Blaze versus Ace Malenko versus Jay Finesse, with Ace Malenko walking out victorious. Inferno Nikki Sixx versus Crazy Fox, with Nikki Sixx walking out victorious. For the men's tag team championships, Wiggy the Rejected and Sicko versus Ray Smooth and Scott Percy, with Wiggy and Sicko walking out the champions. Welcome, West Grim. I'm doing pretty well. How about you? Happy Father's Day, by the way. 4-way matchup between Billy Barber, Jay Money, Lawrence Caldwell, and David Pope backstage, with Lawrence Caldwell walking out victorious. And in the main event, 8-way elimination, the First Lady versus Amaya Bryant versus Blue versus Angel, AJ Michelle versus Big Bertha versus Isabella Steele versus Baby Bone Crusher versus Jules Wigginton, with Jules Wigginton walking out victorious. Now for another ASW show, 2 out of 3 Light Tubes and Tax, Victoria Ritchie versus Kay Shama Red, with Victoria Ritchie walking out victorious. 3-way cage, 2 out of 3 Alu Wilson versus Chico versus Psychosis X, with Psychosis X walking out victorious. Dimebag Dan versus John Robb, with Dimebag Dan walking out victorious. Triple Threat 2 out of 3 Wallace versus Corey Bishop versus Genocide, with Genocide walking out victorious. Men's No Man Lands Championship held under the Underground in a 2 out of 3 Lawrence Caldwell versus Jay Money, with Jay Money walking out victorious. Now for GEW Fight Club Cancer Tour 3. Now, this was a 8-way ladies matchup. Megan Thee Stallion versus Miss Gator Croc versus Kool-Aid versus Dispatcher versus Haley Ramone versus First Lady versus Bunny Black versus Isabella Steele, with Bunny Black walking out victorious. Oconee versus Shaky P versus Inkslinger, with Shaky P walking out victorious. Monica Hernandez versus Kelly North, with Kelly North walking out victorious. OG Bishop Freeman versus Jaquil, with Jaquil walking out victorious. The Villain Todd Wilson versus Zayd the Assassin, with the Villain Todd Wilson walking out victorious. Psycho versus the Problem One, with the Problem One walking out victorious. Mr. Greatest versus the champion Garmar, King of New York Championship, with Garmar retaining the gold. Special guest referee Muffin Top John for the Mecca Street King versus SGK, the champion, for the Worldwide Championship, with SGK retaining the gold in the main event. Now for TXT intake. TXT Rome 10, which is the 10-way gauntlet eliminator. Big Time versus Crazy Larry versus King versus Alu Wilson versus SGK versus Brock Carter versus Jay Prince versus Noah Butler versus Seven Winters versus Swerve Strickland, with SGK walking out victorious. 3-way elimination Lico Lyons versus Sabin versus Taryn Williams, with Lico Lyons walking out victorious. Taylor Griffin versus Big Bertha, with Taylor Griffin walking out victorious. 3-way 2 out of 3 Extreme Rules, the Villain Todd Wilson versus Buster Anderson versus the Phantom Eddie Walker, with the Phantom Eddie Walker walking out victorious. 4-way Extreme Rules, Mr. Cause versus Ace Malenko versus OG Bishop Freeman versus Judah Kane, with OG Bishop Freeman walking out victorious. 3-way elimination, Kai Luana Wilson versus HBIC Nisha versus Dynamite Daisy, with Dynamite Daisy walking out victorious. 3-way, welcome Nick Connors, pro wrestling referee. Hope you are well, sir. 3-way 2 out of 3 Extreme Rules, the Ghost J Jin versus Alex Knight versus Tyson Storm, with Alex Knight walking out victorious. 2 out of 3 Extreme Rules, Artemis versus the Riley the Ripper, with Riley the Ripper walking out victorious. And in the main event, Nagasaki versus Marcus Watts, with Nagasaki walking out victorious. And those were the shows I had to go over. Again, I wish everybody a happy Father's Day, and I hope everybody has a great day, good night, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever y'all may be. Peace out.